Hello and welcome to Movie Marathon Mood. It's the show where we watch a bunch of movies and then we talk about them. It's as simple as that. On this episode, 1970s horror classics, we're talking about The Exorcist, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Jaws. All three movies, 1973, 74, and 75, right in the middle of the 1970s. Three classics to talk about right here. So stick around on Movie Marathon Mood, which begins right now. I'm Jesse Ghostrap, joined by my brother, my friend, Drew Cordell. Drew, how's it going, man?
Oh, Jesse, going well, going well. How about yourself?
Doing fine, doing fine. So we got quite a classic roster for this episode.
Three films considered, not only to be, great genre films, but great films.
Right.
They have a reputation that precedes them, and all three of them have kind of a legacy that somehow is untarnished by sequels in a lot of ways, because the films themselves are still considered to be the best, um, of what they go for. And I think that speaks a lot to it. We're going to talk about whether their legacies live up to it now on a rewatch of all three of these movies, because we've both seen all of them. Of course, definitely, we've probably both seen Jaws. Who knows how many times? Uh, but Exorcist and Texas Chainsaw, we've both also seen and talked about several times before we even conceived of doing a podcast together. So um, it'll be interesting to hear each other's thoughts on these now.
Well, not that it has to be made a big point of, but we're breaking format just a little bit from how we have been doing the show because often we've recorded a little intro before we recorded the entire episode. But the more I thought about these particular movies, I thought not that our opinion can't change or evolve in some way, shape, or form, and that's what we'll talk about. But before we did a recent rewatch, I think we've each seen these movies a decent number of times to begin with. So doing an intro to talk about, I wonder how we're going to feel about this. Didn't exactly feel as appropriate as it might always feel
Right.
because to have a pretty comfortable relationship with all three of these movies. The Exorcist is the one I've seen the least, but I've still seen it a handful of times. And Texas Chainsaw quite a number of times. Jaws, as you suggested, I don't even know how many times I've seen it. It's just one of those movies that is pretty universal, so to speak, in terms of the ubiquity of it, the love for it, the classic nature of it, the Spielbergian flavor of it. I mean, it's the first blockbuster for a reason, and that's not to even get into talking about how good it is or isn't. That's just talking about its mainstream appeal and how common it is to kind of crop up. Yeah, we'll talk about that one here in a bit, though, because we got two other films to talk about before we get to Jaws. And the first one that we had to talk about, The Exorcist.
Something beyond comprehension is happening to a little girl on this street, in this house. A man has been sent for as a last resort to try and save her.
We were talking about earlier before we started recording both of our relationships with it. First time I ever saw The Exorcist, I didn't like it. And I actually saw it when I was a teenager. I was with my dad and my sister. It was a rare occasion where, for whatever reason, I have no idea why, I can't remember why, but my mom was out of town and we rented a bunch of movies. And my dad was like, let's watch The Exorcist. And like, okay, Dad. Um, it's just a funny thought process. Like, oh, I guess that's definitely a mom is out of town movie. to watch The Exorcist. But no, it's not that we were very restricted in terms of what we viewed, but at the same time, watching that movie as a teenager, and maybe particularly in that environment with my sister and my dad, and the reputation around the film itself, I didn't know what to expect. But what I got was a movie that all I could take from it was the obscenity. That was basically the only thing on my first viewing that I remembered was, the obscene nature of some of the parts of the movie. And I basically didn't think it had any substance after that first viewing. But again, I was a teenager and my taste evolved and changed. And over the years, and it was a long time before I rewatched it because I didn't care for it the first time. But I kept thinking about how much I liked William Friedkin. I liked other movies that he made, the cast of the film I liked, and other things. The movie itself, the movie itself has this incredible reputation, and I thought I kind of owe this movie another watch.
Right. Yeah.
And then I did, and I was like, oh, it's a masterpiece. where have I been this whole time? And it was such an unusual change in my perception of the movie. But it really has gotten better. The more I've grown older, the more I've revisited it, the more I guess my taste in cinema has evolved and changed over the years. Holy cow, it's such a great and, nay, I even say beautiful movie. Certainly not just about the shock value, even though the shock value is something that is very apparent for like 1973, because you're talking about, 5 years after the rating system, the MPAA rating system was invented, which means that the standards for what you could get in a movie had radically evolved. And so some of the more obscene or graphic aspects of the movie, no wonder the movie was kind of a sensation to some degree because of just the sheer shock of what you were seeing on the screen. It had never happened before.
Right.
And from a little girl, no less. Like, that's
Yeah.
understandably quite a shocking thing. And it's also going a tiny tangent here, just talking about the 1970s, which is my favorite year or sorry, favorite decade for movies. Part of the reason it was so great really isn't anything to do with the rating system, even though that was there. But it was the changing of the guard. A lot of the people that had been the old Hollywood establishment, they were moving on and had new people coming in and kind of almost taking advantage of it in a way, and standards changing, and they had a freedom that had not really been the case in movies in quite that way. So you had this whole new generation of filmmakers coming in and really just kind of putting their stamp on cinema, and it was the director's decade. It was really kind of incredible to see that kind of naturalism and that kind of voice and vision that happened. And actually, the three movies that we're talking about on this episode kind of moves us into the modern blockbuster, as previously mentioned, to a certain degree. Like, not to step ahead of myself here, but like that's part of the evolution of where we get now, so many decades later. Very different state of cinema. Not to say it's a bad state of cinema, just to say that television has almost become more of a freed thing than the cineplexes. But the 1970s was very free for film and for directors. Yeah, The Exorcist is a keen example of how in the world is this a big studio movie. We don't see enough of these types of big studio movies, frankly. What's your take, Drew, on The Exorcist?
Well, I have a similar beginning with it in that I saw it. I believe I was somewhere between the ages of 13 and 15. Around 1999, they did a re-release with the version you've never seen, a kind of extended cut of the film came out, and I didn't see it in theater or anything because, well, There was definitely a banned movie in my household. I wouldn't have been able to watch it with my parents. I watched it at a friend's house. They had it on DVD, uh, and it had this reputation of a blurb. Really, is the scariest movie of all time. And well, you see it, and as a 13, 14, however old I was, I just, it wasn't the scariest movie of all time, and I I think I was kind of like you. I definitely the vulgarity of it, the obscenity. It was almost comical to me, because I just didn't really understand the power or the terror of someone actually being possessed. I think because I didn't, that wasn't necessarily something that scared me. Again, passing of time and adjusting of tastes, I watched it again as well and appreciated it a lot more. But this time around, I can say without hesitation that, and I probably would have been the same way after the first rewatch, but especially after this one, this is easily one of the best horror films ever, and it would be in my top 10, top five. It would be in my top list, and I think the reason is just of how deliberate the movie is. It's very slow paced, but that's not a bad thing. A lot of times we've both discussed this. People will say, "Oh, that movie's not paced well if it's slow." But honestly, a well-paced movie doesn't mean it's fast all the time. You can be too fast, you can be too slow, but there's that, you know, combination of being just right. Once this movie gets going toward the end, it doesn't let off the gas. When getting started, there's all these pieces that have to be put in place. We have Father Karras played by Jason Miller, and he has kind of a completely, it doesn't really seem like it's connected uh, to the story at first, and I think that's a good thing. It's kind of realistic because a lot of movies, everyone's destined to end up like part of a story, and this one's very natural in the way the story unfolds, and the way people end up involved in the story. I like how it progresses, but he's a priest. He's a psychiatrist as well in the church, and he's kind of going through an underdog kind of story, that his mother, that he, she's getting all these, kind of her caretaker, but he's also in the church, so he's away from her. And she goes through a lot of misfortune. He does with her, and she passes away, and we see kind of his evolution. He talks with another father and talks about, he thinks that he is losing his faith, and he's kind of burnt out on dealing with the problems of others, and also not being able to handle the problems in his own life. We also have the story of Reagan, and her mother. And her mother is an actress, working in Georgetown. They're filming a movie on campus, and they're living in this really nice house there in Georgetown. And Reagan is just a sweet, played by Linda Blair, in a legendary performance. She's very good in this movie, and that's putting it mildly. But when she's unpossessed, she's just a sweet little girl, and and it's no mistake that hits me a little different as a father now than it did as a as a little annoying teenager. Um, I'm much more able to see the the terror of that. But it's not like she's just instantly possessed. It takes a little time for things to unfold, and I think that's great because it gives it time to really simmer and for it to really have an impact. And of course, Ellen Bernstein playing her mom, she's going through all this frustration of trying to find out what's wrong with Reagan, and her performance is amazing as well. It's very believable that trying to diagnose, and these doctors can't come up with a good excuse. They don't know what's wrong with her. How can they? It's it's a demonic possession, but it doesn't come with a tag that says that's what it is. At first it's just a few things like the bed shaking, she's being rocked back and forth on the bed, and then it gets a lot darker. And the scene where the doctors come in to see her when she really is kind of gone, and it's really quick, it's really violent and terrifying all at once. I and you can't have this movie without Max von Sydow as Father Marin, who we get introduced to at the beginning with some really eerie and um, interesting. The way this was, I remember when I saw this thinking, what does this have to do with anything? But I love the way that we're introduced to him, and that the way that we're introduced to the idea of this demon who in the book and in the subsequent sequels is identified as Pazuzu. What a fun name. But anyway, uh, and thankfully Pazuzu is never named in this film.
I'm the devil.
Yeah, which is a great moment, a great moment in the film that's actually used by Father Karras to kind of say, well, I'm not sure this is a possession, because it's common for schizophrenic patients to identify themselves as that. He says he might as well said she's Napoleon Bonaparte.
Right. Yeah.
And I've I think that's the demon playing games. And it's brilliant. I love the way that the demon is, or Pazuzu is, as a character. It's very interesting to just the way, because that's one thing I think, the shock factor, all the crazy stuff that is said. I think that kind of overshadows it for some people, and I understand why people might be uncomfortable, especially the very religious. It is a very shocking movie, if but it's the very nature of the story, though. I don't feel like it's unnecessary. I feel like it fits the tone of this movie. But touching back on Father Marin real quick, he's been in another country, Iraq, digging, and he sees this statue, and the tone, the eeriness of it, the the setup for what unfolds is amazing. And I love that stretch of the movie. Now, this is completely different than I felt about it the first time I saw it. It's actually one of my favorite parts of the movie is the beginning. I When Father Marin shows up, this just that's the poster. That's the one of the most iconic shots of the movie. Not the demon, but Father Marin standing in front of the house in the fog. And to me, he's almost as terrifying as the demon, would like in a good way. Like his presence when he shows up, it's just like, oh boy. Uh, just the way they built him up, the other priests talking about Father Marin off, while he's off camera, building him up. I just love, of course, Max von Sydow is just he's a great, one of the great actors we ever had. But he is aged up in this film. It's he's played an old man his whole career. It feels like, uh, but he is great in this film, and isn't in it a lot, but he sticks with you quite a bit. I mentioned, Father Karras's faith, and I like that, it's more about him than Marin, because Marin's kind of the shining light, and he is the experienced one. But I'm glad we're going through the point of view of Father Karras, because he ultimately ends up being the one that has to make the leap of faith and the choices, and it's very well earned. We've seen him go through some, absolute tragedy in the movie. We've seen him, get confronted with this exorcism, and he, doesn't necessarily believe in it. He is eventually, confronted with the fact that it is very real. And I love the exorcism scene that, Father Marin is just 100% invested, going in on Pazuzu, using these rites, and Father Karras is just aghast, shocked, because it's real, and he's seeing all these crazy things like Reagan's body levitating and all this other, insane things, lightning and all sorts of other stuff happening. And he doesn't, he's supposed to be saying these response rites as well. And Father Marin has to constantly, stay on top of him to keep him in, because he is very shocked and scared. And I love that about this movie, because it's not like they just go in and they're 100% able to and prepared to deal with this. Ultimately, the way it ends up, and Father Marin has had a heart condition that's hinted at, and he passes away in the middle of this, probably because he's going way too hard in on those "the power of Christ compels you." Of he's pretty gung ho with that the first time he says that. I just love that character though, but I love that moment when Karras finds him, and for his first response is just anger and hatred, but he sees that that he's wailing on a little girl, and the moment before when Reagan's mom is like, is she gonna die? You kind of see it in his face. He's made the decision that whatever it costs, he is not gonna let it kill Reagan, not let it be the end of her, and he ends up, taking on the demon, tells it to take him, and sacrifices himself and throws himself out the window. It's such a great story, and it's so well done, and I know this might seem a little bizarre coming from the movie with all the obscenity and shit, but this is just a classy, the way it's told, the way it's handled. It's just a classic story, and this I give it an A+. This is just it's one of the best movies, period, but definitely one of the best horror films of all time. And I definitely understand why there are people out there that are probably a little more hesitant to watch it, or don't care for it, but I completely understand. And don't look down on people who don't, that's not their thing. But I do think that this movie has a reputation it earned. It's it's fantastic. It's well done. It's well filmed. It's just a beautiful, as you said, beautifully told. And I don't know if I have too much else to say other than that it's just that good.
We referenced the opening stretch of the movie, and I mean, I agree with really everything you said, but thinking about that opening stretch, it adds this epic feeling to what's about to follow. That's a
Yeah.
huge part of the success of the movie because it could have started small. It could have just started with Reagan and Chris and just started with their small family story and evolved to the point of realizing demonic possession, you know. But instead, it starts with Father Marin and this whole Middle Eastern journey, you know, like, and it just adds this gravitas,
Right.
which Max von Sydow already adds gravitas just by being there. It's uh, kind of always been his modus operandi, you know, the adding gravitas to anything, including many a genre film. But obviously, he's been in so many great movies, Seventh Seal being a chief among them. Definitely known to many because of the way he's popped up in so many genre films, even in recent years. But he just immediately lands this level of import.
Right.
And when he shows up at the ending, obviously the iconic shot, but even when they're walking up and Karis is wanting to like, oh, let me get you keyed into the story, and I got to tell you about who this girl actually is and what I witnessed so far from all these demons. It appears to be multiple demons, and he's immediately shot down. It's only one, and
Yeah.
I just absolutely love that, you know, because it's not that Marin is callously bringing him down. He's just he already knows what he's walking into. He's already like not that he by any means obviously he does care. It's certainly not that he doesn't care about the person that he's trying to save, but he walks into that room knowing steadfast, get rid of the demon. I'm focused on this task, and I'm not gonna pay heed to the demon and any manipulation that the demon is going to try to do. He's already in the right state of mind, basically. And
Right.
like you said, in terms of having to get Karis back on track, you know, uh, right back into the rights, because Karis is just so taken by, you know, the spectacle and the terror of that spectacle. And Marin is 100% just, this is what we got to do, believe in Christ and cast out the demon, and, you know, just 100% keyed in.
Right.
It's just a powerful thing, and Max von Sydow is a huge part of the success of the movie. And Ellen Burstyn is one of my favorite actors. Period. Seeing her, you know, as this mother fraught dealing with her daughter, and also being a person of science herself, you know, like believer in science and wanting to do something, but also realizing what she's seeing and frustrated that nobody's really taking this in a serious light. Everybody has this rationalization that walks in the face of what's actually happening and what's even happening in front of their own faces. She's like looking them in the eyes and like, did you not just see that? Did you not? How are you treating this? Oh, it's just a mental break. You know, it's just a break in her mind, and oh, it's just a extra power that she has because of that mental break. Certainly not a demon. That's not rational. And that's also a part of the movie too, is how they, many fantasy stories or modern fantasy stories deal with it in the same way. The idea that uh, something that has been myth is coming back. Game of Thrones does that. Like, oh, dragons. Like, who really believes in dragons ever having been a thing? And then, of course, you see dragons being born. Obviously, it's a very different thing than demons, but hopefully, you take my point. It's like this the success of the story in kind of making this mythological power into something real and tangible. And that's a huge part of the success of The Exorcist and Linda Blair being fantastic. And I'm certainly not wanting to take away from her performance, but obviously it was manipulated a lot too,
Right.
where she didn't know everything that was happening in the story, thank goodness.
Right.
But
Right.
the movie, I think, very much belongs to Jason Miller and like the whole storyline that Karis has. Like that's really the heart and soul of the movie, and that's something that I don't think obviously, like, as mentioned, appreciated the first time I watched it. A part of what I didn't appreciate was Jason Miller's journey in the movie, and even though it's tragic and horrific toward the end, it's also a tremendous act of heroism, and that's the moving part of it is watching him be that hero and get to the point that he would make that choice and make that leap, so to speak, quite literally.
Right.
But regardless of which, like when you have those moments of him dealing with his mom, or that, there's so many haunting shots in this. And obviously the finale is a big, big part of those iconic haunting images. But when he sees his mom on the bed,
Oh yeah.
is just that it doesn't have the linger on it. And that's another thing that this movie does so successfully is it doesn't have to expound on anything really.
No.
It just kind of has this naturalism and lets it unfold as it would. And it just has to do this in tiny increments. Just that one image is enough for you to get how this demon is playing with Karis and trying to manipulate him. And it works at times. you know, it's trying to break him. But that is that is a haunting image, and I'm also haunted by the image of when Marion is dead and Karis walks in, and uh, the Reagan thing is standing at the foot of the bed.
Yes.
Oh my God, that is just like I said, just that one image. You don't have to expound on that at all. It's just you see that, and the gravity of it is felt, and the potential beyond that is already known. So it's terrifying. Terrifying in terms of what it can mean for their souls, basically, and that's what's being fought for in so many ways. Yeah, it's just a powerful movie, and it's terrifying, but it's terrifying in a very specific kind of way, in an atmospheric kind of way. I could understand how it could be uh, seen differently, in terms of feeling that it's gimmicky or feeling that it's just obscene, but that would be to miss all the underlying power of the story. And I think the great way in which it is told. I 100% agree with A plus. Like 'cause it's just that good of a movie, and that classic of a movie,
Yes.
a classical, well told story. It's just really hard to beat, honestly. And it also has to be mentioned the score to the film, which adds immensely to the atmosphere and obviously the iconography as well. Tubular bells.
It's easily one of the most memorable and haunting horror film themes. I think you can, put it next to Psycho. I think you can put it next to Halloween, um, and I think you could put it next to Jaws as some of the most memorable and lasting and perfect, pitch perfect horror film scores, and it fits right there. Just the first time we hear it, it's nothing particularly scary is happening, but the atmosphere of the movie, and you point that out well. This film thrives on the atmosphere, and that is what sells it. I mean, there is a heart to the story, and then there is good writing and good acting, and it's all pitch perfect too. But the atmosphere is what really, you know, sets this one completely apart. And the music has just the few times we do hear that theme, it plays a significant role in that, and just the kind of a foreboding and a chilling sensation that it brings.
And even the absence of music at plenty of points too, you know.
Definitely. And there, that adds to the tension. I think is the lack of it, especially in you know the the exorcism itself. Yeah, I can't really gush enough about it. It's just watching it this other time. Yeah, I knew I liked it. I knew I liked it a lot. Uh, but it just I was kind of over the moon with it this time, and and it is just a fantastic film.
I also love the way that so many people get roped into it, you know, doctors and so forth, and priests, different priests that are all talking about ways they would or wouldn't deal with this situation, and how the church itself has evolved beyond exorcism and not believing the situation, essentially.
Right.
All these people not believing the situation, even sometimes when they witness some crazy things. But it it's amazing how the movie has that feel of you can almost see the outsider's perspective
Yeah.
and see how isolated it feels too. Like even though Chris is bringing all these people in, witness her daughter and trying to help her daughter, there's all this kind of beyond the commotion, the rationalization that's happening, and watching all the medical practices and stuff is some of the scariest parts of the movie too. Sometimes, you know,
Yeah. Definitely.
just the handling of the these big machines that are loud and the blood spurting, and with the doctor, it's terrifying in and of itself. Just seeing that part of it, and also understanding that it's not going to make a difference. Yeah, just the natural way that they try to rationalize everything, and how at the end of the day, how would anybody believe that this had happened? Just seeing this mother and daughter leaving and being like, oh, by the way, this insanity just happened. And sure, people know the tragedy happened, that several people died,
Right.
but they wouldn't know. Oh, and there was a demon, and the complete gravity of the situation would be lost to almost everybody. I just like the way that it's isolated and not at the same time. Basically, the way that horror could be happening in your next door neighbor's home, theoretically, and you wouldn't know about it or believe it necessarily. That's just such an interesting notion too. And I like the way the movie deals with that.
Right.
But yeah, definitely an A+ movie and a classic of its kind. With that being said, from 1973 to 1974, the very next year for Texas Chainsaw Massacre. speaking of the budget and the studio influence of The Exorcist, that's not the case with Texas Chainsaw. Texas Chainsaw is a cheaper, grittier movie and definitely not a big budget studio venture, but also very much a product of the 70's and the ability for more kinds of movies to break out. You know, you could see more independent cinema starting to break out because instead of having to be under the Hays Code, you don't have to be as mainstream. You can make a smaller movie and break out
Right.
because there's actual different standards going on at that point. And Texas Chainsaw is this gritty movie. Like, it's obviously, I don't want to say the polar opposite of The Exorcist, but it's a very different style of film, a very different style of horror. And in many ways, I would call it like a pure horror movie.
Right.
You know, like probably the most perfect, in my opinion, the most perfect example of that kind of movie. Because talking about sequels, and Texas Chainsaw has sequels and remakes, and most of which I have not seen. But what's interesting is like when you have a sequel, say all the sequels to Halloween, for instance. Halloween is this very pure horror movie. Here's Michael Myers. We know he's a killer. He's pure evil, even as a kid. And he gets out later and he is pure motivation, evil, killing. You know, there he goes. When the sequels started happening, they feel the need to add something. And not to say that depth can't matter or be helpful, because obviously that's silly to argue against depth and development. But so many times you have, oh, we got to figure out why is Michael Myers after Lori,
Right.
and oh, they have a family connection, or oh, we got to learn more about Michael Myers and why he is the way he is, or you know, all the different ways that you have family connections or uh, rationalizations for the villain. These sorts of things. I don't want to say get in the way, but it's almost inevitable that you kind of clutter up sometimes the purity of a story the more you kind of go into sequels and so forth or beyond something. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre is, I think, even more pure than the original Halloween because it's just like you don't even get the here's Michael Myers introduction. It's like, oh, here's a bunch of young people going out on a trip and they just happen to run into this family of evil people. And the evil people, they weren't expecting this group of young people. They weren't inherently hoping for that. There's no build up or motivation trying to rope these people in. It just kind of happens. And that it's just the encounter itself just kind of happens. And I suppose I could see where somebody could say that I want more, you know, than that. But I think this movie does that sort of pure storytelling incredibly well and incredibly effectively. Where uh, not to get too grandiose about it, but it's part of the reason I think the movie works for me and that I think so much of it is because you have this kind of handling of what evil is, you know, the the idea of who are these people, this family, and so forth. But uh, you don't know where you could or couldn't run into evil,
Right.
and it doesn't have to be this supernatural thing or this epic sort of story or anything else. It doesn't have to be, oh, and now we learn about how this character became evil and the trauma they experienced and why they have rationalized becoming evil. Instead, it's just almost fundamental in a way that you could run into something that's evil, and obviously a terrifying prospect. But like when I think about one of my pet peeves is say with a school shooting or something to that effect, when it happens in somebody's community, and you always hear somebody say, I didn't think it would happen here. It's one of my biggest pet peeves, because obviously they could mean, boy, is this ever surreal for it to be happening here, or to be happening to me. You hear about it happening, but it actually happened in front of me in my community, or perhaps literally to me. That is incredibly surreal. But often I feel like, because people literally say it, what I think people are saying is not just that it's surreal, but that, well, we have a good community, and I see all types of good people in my community, and everybody's nice here, and we live together and work together and play together, and like all these positive attributes, or
Right.
we have a good law enforcement. We have good law enforcement here. Whatever it is, people will say, I can't believe it happened here, because we have a good group of people, because we are pure in some way. And it's a pet peeve of mine, hopefully obvious enough before I even say it, but I don't like, if you see that it is a possibility that something dark or terrible could happen in the world, then of course it could happen to you. It doesn't mean that it's inevitable,
Right.
but it does mean that it could happen to you. You're not somehow above or beyond that darkness happening to you. And obviously, you should try to deal with that. It's not to say, oh, it's just inevitable and there's nothing we can do about it. But it does mean that it is something that exists and it could happen to you. So, as much as you shouldn't be paralyzed by fear and not go on a random trip out into the middle of nowhere with your friends to go to some house that you know about to possibly play and just hang out in the summertime. But there is something terrible that could happen to you. And maybe you shouldn't pick up that hitchhiker, and maybe not go exploring a house where you don't know for sure if somebody is or isn't in there. But even if it looks abandoned from the surface. But again, not that you should be paralyzed by fear. Uh, no, I just think that the movie, like I said, I try not to go too unwielding on a tangent there, but uh, it's just the idea of how purely this story deals with that idea of, and it just happened, and it just happened to these people, and we don't really get to know them in a deep way. But one of the other things that I think is incredibly clever about the movie is they feel real, but they also don't feel completely like stereotypes. Because so many times you have these kinds of movies, and it's like, oh, and here's the nerd, and here's the this, or the, here's the buxom blonde, and instead that just you just feel like real people,
Right.
and they could possibly be obnoxious at times, but they also deep down have, I feel like, what's almost a fundamental goodness. Like if you look at the very end of the movie, which is intense and terrifying, but what else you see is like when these people uh, are encountered on the road, and they see a woman being chased, they don't run away. So many horror movies deal with the way that people ignore the violence around them,
Right.
and in this movie, there's almost like a fundamental, like, oh, I need to stop and try to help her. And there's also this almost gravity to the way certain things are done, like very simple, subtle little filmmaking tricks. Because Toby Hooper is incredible, but you have that shot that goes underneath the swing,
Yeah.
walking up to the house to investigate, and what just happened to my friend in there. And it's just a simple shot, but so much could be said about how the movie looks dark and gritty, because it does, but it's also impeccably well made. And you have a shot like that that's not just a good shot, it like enhances the idea of something the character's not even aware of,
Right.
the impending doom. I don't know. Have you seen Hereditary?
I have not.
So I don't want to by any means spoil that movie, but there's something else this movie does, which is uh, it goes into fundamental fear that could get so intense and so ingrained in you that you would run out of a window. And I've never seen that type of thing done so well until Hereditary. Again, not to spoil Hereditary, but I'm really just praising Texas Chainsaw by saying like how effectively it gets across the idea that you could believe a character would just be embroiled by fear,
Right.
sitting in that butcher shop with the door open, like not knowing when the guy with the chainsaw may or may not show up again, being left alone for a moment and not just hoping for any sort of relief, but then ultimately not even getting it.
Right.
The movie's just, like I said, it pure horror movie and one of my favorite horror movies in again a very different way than The Exorcist, but I absolutely love the way that this movie is kind of just this fundamental thing. What's your spin and take on Texas Chainsaw?
Well, it's just a formidable movie. I mean, it has a drive and look to it. Of course, again, the cheaper budget and look, but it doesn't look like just some cheap movie though. It's competently made. As Toby Hooper was a fantastic director to say the least, and I even think that as absurd as the number two of this series is, the only other Texas Chainsaw film to be directed by him is a brilliant movie too. It's just completely tonally different. But and then when you look at Poltergeist and see what he can do with a huge budget, um, and the production of Spielberg, that this guy was immensely talented. But I am all just equally impressed with what he does with a smaller budget, because the look and feel of this movie, the atmosphere in this one is killer as well, and completely different than the Exorcist. But the atmosphere in this movie, it's just, as you say, it's kind of as it happens. Ridley Scott actually pointed out in one of the documentaries for Alien, I believe, that the film he was constantly showing uh, while doing preparation while filming Alien was Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because he thought it was like the perfect, formidable horror film, and he was basically wanting to do Texas Chainsaw in space. And in a way, there are similarities. You got these hitchhikers, and I think this just speaks to how good this movie is. These hitchhikers or these kids are driving around. They end up picking up a hitchhiker, and it just kind of all goes sideways. And an Alien, you got these space truckers, and they end up getting a distress signal. They go investigate, and it all goes sideways. I mean, there's kind of a simplistic purity, as you said, to to both of those. But the I the Leatherface is, of course, the thing that people, I think, and if they haven't ever seen a Texas Chainsaw movie, that's he's going to be the thing they know and recognize, because he's an iconic character. But I don't think, because a lot of times he gets lumped in as a slasher, like a Michael Myers or a Jason Voorhees, or and I don't think that's really fair or accurate, And I don't even, the other Texas Chainsaw sequels, as crazy as they are, they're not even really slasher movies either. It's really kind of this Sawyer family that is the kind of the evil, and kind of get overlooked in the I think in the broader public. But the little touches, the of the house, like the homestead, it's just terrifying. The shots of all the uh like the skeletons and animal carcasses, and the shot of the house looming kind of in a beautiful sky, like a pitch blue and clouds, but then this house just looms. It's terrifying. I i think that, as you said, this is just kind of like they're going along and this happens, and we see it in the tremendous amount of fear that they have, and it's realistic. I really believe, like Sally and all of them, like their fear in the moments that come. And another thing I think that's unfairly tacked on this movie is kind of that it has a lot of gore, um, and it doesn't. It has a lot of suggestion, and it has a lot of things that do happen, and you see it, but it's never shown directly to you. Or when it is, it's done in a way that's not gratuitous. Some of these kill scenes, the more disturbing thing to me about the kill scenes is not the gore or anything, because like I said, there's really not that much. It's like the acting, like when the guy gets hit in the head with a sledgehammer or with a hammer, and he just spasms
Yeah.
after he's dead. Or when the girl get Pam gets put on a hook, and you basically just sit there and watch her die, watch her die. It's, or she has to watch her friend get chainsawed after he's been been killed too. Yeah, it's as she's sitting there with a hook in her. It's very disturbing, and I think all of that serves to the horror of the film even more, that it's not just blood and guts, that it forces you to imagine some things um, a little bit too, and that's even scarier. The I think the fear, just the is just pitch perfect. It comes to a crescendo really at the that dining room scene, which is to me the best part of the movie. Um, just so much tension. There's just been so much that's happened, and she's basically screaming hysterically the entire time. And Leatherface is all up in her face, wearing makeup, dressed like a woman. Um, but the old man, the hitchhiker from earlier, you know, they're just terrifying. They're sadistic, evil people, and just their sheer presence. It's hard to watch, even having seen it several times. It's a hard movie to watch, but in a good way. Like it's not a a popcorn film to me. It's I don't really feel comfortable when I watch Texas Chainsaw, and I think that that speaks highly of it, because that's what it's going for. It's not trying to be a comfort movie. And of course, you pointed out, I think, the ending like in Halloween, Laurie Strode's running around trying to get people to help. Um, and, people are like, whatever, crazy lady, turn their lights off. This, you got a trucker and then another person in a pickup truck, try to help Sally when they see her, covered in blood and run away from Leatherface. But my favorite part of that scene is like just the when she's laughing, like in the like she's going from screaming to laughing almost in like um without any pause. Like the screams become laughs as she makes it. The adrenaline, the ecstasy of getting out. And then of course the most, probably the most iconic thing about the scene of this movie is the chainsaw dance, uh, that Leatherface does, kind of in frustration or triumph, or who knows. But the experience of this movie it's one of a kind. And and like I said, it's formidable. You put it in, there's like a sense of dread, foreboding that just kick in, like with that opening narration. Uh, this isn't based on a true story, although some things are taken from Ed Gein, which I think Ed Gein, if nothing else, has contributed to so many cinematic serial killers. I don't know. This is another A plus. I mean, just the atmosphere of this movie. It's one of a kind. It feels real. It feels like it really happened. A movie I often compare this to is Night of the Living Dead. Just because Night of the Living Dead is another film that was made on the cheap, but has this incredible tension and atmosphere and real feeling in the performances and in the execution of it as well. And this is that on an even uh like cranked up to 11, like on in terms of like just the fear and the adrenaline you feel watching it. It gets under your skin, and I feel that way every time I've seen it, and I've seen it a handful of times. And yeah, it just it's one of the best horror movies. Is another one that makes my top 10 easily, top five. It just has that power to it.
Obviously, Alien is a very different movie, but you can still see that influence. And I mentioned that shot that goes underneath the swing. There's a similar shot in Alien where Harry Dean Stanton is walking in, through the looking for Cat
Right.
Jonesy, and as he's walking into this space, and it's just kind of this tracking movement, and actually a tracking shot without him even in it, but it's just this feeling of impending doom, this feeling of approaching evil almost.
Yeah.
It's just a really effective, terrifying shot. Two different shots, very different movies, but that idea, that feeling that you get is incredibly palpable. And the idea of being treated like meat, just being treated like an animal, grabbed and just shoved onto a hook, that's obviously the way that happens so fast is also part of its effect. Like, just imagine you're just walking around and it's a nice sunny day, and you're just out with your friends, and next thing you know, like, hey, what's happening over here? And you're being grabbed and shoved into a hook, and then you're put into a freezer and like treated like an animal, treated like a piece of meat. witnessing all this horror, it's effective just how immediate and terrifying, like a shot of Leatherface slamming that door shut. It's the effect is immediate, and the foreboding and the atmosphere of the movie is incredible as well. That dinner scene is something else, and also darkly humorous too, in some ways. Handing over the hammer like beat her, and obviously there's not enough strength in that man to do anything. Hardly he's not going to be able to lift that mallet or do anything with it to damage somebody. He can't even hold it,
Right.
much less lift it and slam it on somebody. And at the same time, it's obviously still terrifying because
Right.
he's being assisted and because there's still this sense of danger. And like I said, I just really do just think it's just a pure horror movie. you know, if you wanted to know the essence of horror in a movie, I feel like that's the movie I would go to. It's an easy A+ for me as well. I don't know where exactly it would fall in a ranking of horror movies or movies in total, but it's definitely way up there in terms of fitting on that paradigm. And it's almost difficult to articulate exactly what it does so well in some ways too, because it just kind of is and it just kind of happens. But it's not like it. The movie's doing plenty within. There's so much craft within it, and so much that has this kind of power over you as you watch it that does indeed make it very uncomfortable. And there's barely anything that's uncomfortable in that same way in our next movie, Jaws.
Slow ahead. I can go slow ahead. Come on down and chump some of this shit.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Not to say that the Jaws doesn't have uncomfortable, it has horror scenes, that can be scary or anything else. Like Gwent at the end is definitely, I think, the peak of this movie actually being kind of unsettling to watch. A huge part of that being Robert Shaw's performance.
Right.
It's just like, oh man, that seems like genuine terror. He actually did die several years after this movie, just a few years later. So that for whatever reason, that scene has always been oddly haunting to me. Because I've never been alive when Robert Shaw was alive. Plus, I heard this recently, just hearing about Robert Shaw in real life, about his alcoholism, and how there were plenty of people that said when he wasn't drunk on the set of Jaws, he was a super nice guy. He was drunk all the time.
Yeah.
When he was sober, he was great.
Right.
He was drunk almost the entire time. He actually tried to be genuinely drunk during the USS Indianapolis story, but they had to redo it later because he was too drunk. So he just acted it later, acted drunk. Because really drunk, it was unintelligible, which is hilarious and awesome. But certainly not to suggest that Jaws isn't an effective horror movie, but it's a very different kind of horror movie than either of the other two we watched for this episode. It's an entertaining movie. It's also two different movies in some ways. There's the first half on the island, and the second half that's the adventure movie out on the boat chasing the shark, of just our three main characters, essentially. I will say that before we get too deep into the weeds, necessarily, that I think the second half of the movie is way better than the first half, personally. And I do like the first half a good deal, but I have little problems with it. And I think watching it again this time, which again I don't know how many times I've seen it, the thing that bothered me the most was Sheriff's wife. There's something about her that's almost a little bit too exaggerated. Ellen Brody, but her there's something about her, like she laughs a little bit too intently at Richard Dreyfuss.
Right.
She's I don't know, like I'm trying to define exactly what it is. There's something that's like probably my favorite moment with her is whenever she sees the book that her husband's been looking at the sharks, and realizes that she wants her kids to get off of the boat.
Yeah.
Because before that, she's like, "Oh, let them play. They're not actually in the water; they're just on the boat."
Right.
And then she sees that book and tells them to jump off. But there's something almost just a little bit too hysterical about her, and she's not like the biggest presence in the movie. But I almost feel like if you gave this, which is a weird thing to say, maybe, but if you gave this same movie to Spielberg several movies later, it'd be even stronger.
Right.
And some of the human interactions like that. But something that used to bother me the last time I watched it and reviewed it, I I talked about the mayor and how he seemed just a little bit too unreal to me. And certainly nothing has broken this movie for me. Like I've always loved it, but at the same time, like if I'm gonna nitpick something here or there, like the mayor, like oh that seems a little bit too unreal that he would be that adamant to get people out on that beach. And something about 2020 has made me change my opinion about the mayor and how believable I find that whole sequence of him insisting that summer will happen no matter what, and the economy matters more than having people out on the beach
Right.
and keeping people alive and away from the beach. God, a shark is not that big of a threat. Still, people out there. We'll have people out on watch. Everybody will still be safe. Yeah, my opinion on that has shifted a little bit.
I'm imagining Trump like bitten in half by a great white like Quint saying the water's fine, come to the beach. 'Cause, I don't want to interject on your point too much, but I think that I'm kind of the same way with you on this because that was something I always, and it was, I don't know if it was that I didn't find it believable, but I was just like, nobody can be that stupid.
Well, that's stupid, but also that empowered to do it.
Right, right,
Like, surely they'd be able to like insist that the beaches be closed.
right. It's just like in recent years, the governments empower in bad situations, and and I don't think this is anything new, but I think it's kind of been on a larger and more public scale that that they will downplay these catastrophic events for their own financial gain or for to avoid panic. In Japan with the Fukushima incident, there was a mishandling of that. A few years, several years back, and in a way that was similar to this kind of thing, and um, a movie that I hope we review at some point and do an episode on. Shin Godzilla actually uh, criticizes, is very much a satire and criticism of that kind of thing. And here we are, years later, and we've got the same, almost a similar thing with coronavirus happening on a global scale, and the United States being one of the bigger perpetrators of just misinformation and ignorance um, over this. And I think that Shin Godzilla also feels kind of relevant to that, but Jaws definitely does as well. With Jaws getting this boost of relevance, something that I hate that makes it relevant is that, people are losing their lives to this virus. And, I didn't know anybody personally, but there's someone connected to Christy's family that lost their life. And then I have known people that actually had it. And this administration has continually mocked and laughed and rejected notions that it's anything to be feared, even when the president has had it. And if we can get into whether he even actually had it or not, or if he's even himself, if he's been dead for a year and this is a clone. um there's there's so many crazy things. But going to back to Jaws, the mayor, seeing that kid get killed, which to me, I think that to me, that kid getting killed has always been the most haunting part of this movie, when he's out there on the raft.
Sure.
And
And a geyser.
just the amount of blood that comes up, but just the ignorance of that, the and harmful, hateful ignorance. Like, well, it's inconvenient for me that this kid died, but we're going to have money. We're going to have for 4th of July. We're going to do this. The shark the shark comes back, it's still there. Jaws is still out there. Watching it this time, it really it made me hate the mayor even more. I hated the mayor character already, but this time I hate him for different reasons. But again, I think it is believable, and sadly, it's believable, but it is.
I hate that it's become as relevant as it has been. And obviously, you could look at stories like Chernobyl is another example, and also a recent miniseries in HBO that's incredible,
Right.
that shows the corruptness of government or mishandling of a terrible situation, to say the very least about it. Just the ignorance and the not really believing the gravity of a situation, or not caring enough about safety protocols. Bottom dollar ultimately kind of being part of the problem in terms of having it be safe enough to begin with. But yeah, this Jaws had like, I'll tell you, the least believable thing now is, in a sense, is the mayor eventually does have a change of heart. Uh, oh, I don't believe that anymore.
Right.
I mean, obviously, I do, because that anybody can have a change of heart, but there are also people who wouldn't, and it's almost too much to imagine that there are people that wouldn't ever have that change of heart, that would just stay steadfast regardless of anything that happens, regardless of children dying. Like, as you said, seeing a little boy die violently, that should be a turning point, to say the least. But there just too many things have to happen before they actually do get sent off on their adventure and the beach actually does close. Yeah, it's a startling thing that's become, unfortunately, relevant in way too large a fashion, and it's changed the way that I've watched Jaws, um, and the way that it affected me in particular right now in this moment. But I also try to get on a different track again, and I'll use Ellen Brody again to do it. That moment when she like sends off her husband and she runs away crying is the last time we see her. It's kind of weird. Like, not that we need uh, to see resolution to every little storyline, but like that to me kind of highlights the problem with her and her character.
Right.
Is like the storyline barely seems to matter to the movie,
Yeah.
and as part of why the second half of the movie works so well to me is because those three characters gel so well. I think that's the heart and soul of the movie, and why it works so much is because you have this incredible dynamic between Roy Scheider and Richard Dreyfuss and Robert Shaw. Their adventure out in the water basically is the movie, and it's also probably the biggest headache that they had making the movie, actually being out in the water. The biggest thing that people talk about in terms of behind the scenes of Jaws is the trouble they had with the shark, mechanical shark, and ways that they had to be inventive, because showing the bad looking shark and the mechanically failing shark wasn't going to work so well. But all the effort shows in making the movie better, and then the second half is a better movie. Partially probably because of how hard they had to work, but also because the movie also has the focus. It's forced to focus on these three guys. I do think plenty of people have said that this is Spielberg's best movie, and I just plainly don't agree with it. That's just my personal opinion about it being where it sits on the Spielberg pantheon. I think Spielberg became a better filmmaker afterward, but I also think that this movie shaped him. And there's so many great touches, though, that showcase his ability of staging, that showcase his humanity. One of the best scenes in the movie is the scene between Chief Brody and his son.
Right.
That's like one of the best. Like that's the Spielberg magic right there.
Yeah.
That's not going to be seen in most monster movies. Is a scene that stops and does that, but that's the difference. Having little touches like that, seeing the son mimicking his dad, it's really effective. But I also like the way that the movie very subtly deals with like class and different ways of thinking, especially in that main trio. And obviously, you throw a mayor in there too in terms of status and where people fall in paradigm. But you have the working class Quint coming in and saying he's going to save the day, and being very dogmatic about it. Like, I'm going to get the shark. No way I'm not going to get the shark. Just give me the money and I'll do it. Give me the resources, I'll do it. Grumbling his way through it. And then having the wealthy scientist by Richard Dreyfuss, who is not your typical wealthy character in a movie either. But the way that the movie kind of deals with that paradigm by also just making these people real, making those guys in particular feel real, I think is a huge part of the effect of the movie. Like just those guys feel real. I could pick on Ellen Brody probably the entire episode to my heart's content for no good reason, because it's not the main part of the movie. But those three guys in particular, very real, and they feel dynamic, and I feel like, oh, I can believe those guys, and I can see the ways in which they all get deflated in one way or another. Because the chief doesn't know anything about being out in a boat or tying these knots, and he gets chastised quite a number of times and ends up nearly breaking Richard Dreyfuss's legs, at one point. That seafaring stuff is just terrific. That's, like I said, that's my favorite part of the movie. The adventure stuff, the sharing of scars on the boat, getting drunk, and the way that the Brody looks at a scar briefly, thinking, should I share my own scar story? No, that's silly. Shouldn't do that. It's not a good story. Just a tiny little detail like that. There are a lot of little touches in this movie that work so well. But I do still, even though like I love the movie, I ultimately give it a solid A grade.
And that's fair. And I kind of fall in a similar scale on that too. It's for different reasons, but it kind of has to do with like, to me, I completely agree with what you said about this Spielberg being. I mean, and this is a great Spielberg movie. I mean, don't get us wrong. Uh,
Of course,
because it's not like he started out as a chump. I mean, he started out as Spielberg. This is not his first movie, but this is his big break. And it's great, and it is one of his most iconic movies, and there's reason for that. But I do think that even in, just a few subsequent years, Spielberg made better movies. And I think that a little bit of I wouldn't call it a problem, but my nitpicking, it kind of has to do with the first act too. Just something about it. The man, even though I do acknowledge that stuff is realistic now, it still just bugs me. And it's not that it's bad, and it's not that, but but there are other aspects of just the whole village, the island segment, that let the the kids pretending to be a shark, and then that guy just like clumsily falling in, trying to help them get it. That part's always kind of been dumb to me. But I mean, it doesn't mean that it's bad, but
No.
just little things. But I think a lot of people, a lot of people talk about Quint, for good reason, because Robert Shaw is amazing in this movie. I think that, and it's not to say I think one's better than the other, but I think Roy Scheider's performance as Brody is just what makes this movie what it is. And he's this good man, and he's kind of an everyman, and but he's faced with this impossible situation, this shark. He doesn't know how to face it. He used to be a big city cop. He's not used to dealing with a shark in the ocean, and he has a mayor that he's pitted against, that he's trying to do what's best for the public and close the beach down, and he's getting pushback at doing that for financial and economic reasons. And then he's got his family that he's worried about. That's that scene with his son at the table, again, like, that's just such a great moment, great scene. But I we see most of this movie through his eyes, and in a lot of ways, this is going to be might be a stretch of a comparison, but I've always kind of thought of Brody as kind of like Gary Cooper in High Noon, in that, like, he's in this situation and he's trying to do the right thing, and everywhere he turns he's getting pushback, feedback that is, resistance. And in the end, he finally ends up having to do it himself. And it's a little different in Jaws, that he's got Hooper and Quint with him on the boat, but ultimately at the end that doesn't matter. It ends up just being him. I think that something I never really realized, and this film and The Exorcist actually are kind of structured similarly, in that The Exorcist begins with, kind of normal life, and then the demon taking over, and we see things through Karras's eyes, and um, at the end, it's almost a whole other movie, a segment, the exorcism itself. And Father Marin is this larger than life character, and ultimately he's taken out of the picture, and Karras has to grab on and do something. And I think it's kind of similar with Jaws, that we have the shark, we have these scenes, we have the opening scene, of course, with the woman getting pulled under and eaten, the little boy. We had the big, 4th of July celebration, and all these things. But the what we've already alluded to being the best section of the movie is the adventure on sea with Brody, Hooper. Yeah, and Richard Dreyfuss is amazing in this too. I think all three of the main characters are just so great in this, and you're right, they gel together completely. But that's, we're on the boat with them. That's what it feels like. But that last section of the movie is just so incredibly intense. Where even as comfort, this movie is more comfort food than the other two we've watched. Uh, but that's not a downplay at all. This is a blockbuster. This is a popcorn movie, but it's still intense and kind of does have that level of despair to it in the end, with Jaws just destroying that boat, that little rinky-dink boat that everybody loves so much, the Orca. I just kind of love that Quint is so confident, and he's so, or appears so confident, and but he's terrified, and you can see it even before he dies, which is the obvious part, but you can see it in his eyes, in the performance, in the story of the Indianapolis, that whole section. I mean, you can see these underlying things. And I think the intensity of the final showdown with Jaws, and Hooper kind of gets taken out of the picture. Um, not for He does not die. He kind of led to believe that he might have died or something, but he pops up at the end, survived. But it's just Brody and Quint, and Quint's the one we all kind of expect to be equipped to handle this, and he gets killed. And the screams and the terror, and it's unnerving. And Brody takes kind of, not exactly like Karras in The Exorcist, but he's forced to take it upon himself, and be kind of resourceful in the way that he does it. And Tank gets in Jaws' mouth, and you know he he ends up blowing it up. But the build up to that is just so cool, and it's just so intense. It's so well done that it's one of the best stretches of any movie, really. I could put the end of Jaws up against a lot of different things, and Jaws would probably come close to coming on top, because that is one of the best runs in any movie I've ever seen. This is going to be really funny, because I've actually gotten in an argument with somebody, Andy Heath, to be precise, a friend of ours, that this isn't even a horror film, that Jaws isn't a horror movie. And you made it the most. I think you made the most accurate. The first part really kind of is, and I admit that too. That like the first half of this movie really kind of definitely is horror. In the movie, it is a horror movie. But the reason I kind of push back against that, back when I've had this argument, is that, when I think of Jaws, I think of that last section, the last segment on the ocean. And it's more of an adventure film to me. But the last section of that section is definitely terrifying. It is intense, and uh, it is horror. And so this is a horror movie. I admit being wrong. I'm not going to admit that to Andy Heath's face, but probably because I won't see him anytime soon. But uh, I do think that this is a horror film, but it's got that Spielberg touch, and that sense of adventure, and it sets it apart. And this movie was huge. One of the, there have been big box office hits before. We already talked about, I mean, Exorcist was a huge film uh, for its time, and The Godfather, the year before Exorcist, was a huge film. There had been big successes before, but Jaws kind of just broke the doors down and became just the first real blockbuster hit. And, it wouldn't be too long that something else would redefine that a couple of years later. It seems like we always end up mentioning Star Wars for one reason or another. But yeah, I mean, it's for good reason. But, Jaws really solidified those that kind of entertainment. And, my mom would always tell me that she was one of the people that was scared to go into the ocean because of Jaws, because she was a teenager when it came out, or a young teenager, and like it just hit pitch perfect. And they would go to the beach in the summers, and she just was very hesitant to get in the water because of Jaws. And it's one of those movies that has that effect, like you know, I'm sure people were afraid to get in showers in hotels because of Psycho for a long time. I'm sure other films have had those kind of reactions, but Jaws definitely, even today, kids younger, because I consider myself, when I first saw it, Jaws definitely made me scared of water for a little bit. I'll still get in it. I still love getting in the ocean, but when I can, it has one of those long lasting effects on people. And I think it speaks to the power of Spielberg and the power of the movie. But this is, and to give this an A is not a slap in the face to it at all. Or like, uh,
No.
I think, people might come at me for this. I think Spielberg actually did this type of movie better later with Jurassic Park. Um, it might be a controversial opinion. I don't know, but I think he's done a better version of this. And not to say that they're the same movie, because they're not. They're huge differences. But in terms of there being a little bit of terror and creatures or animals, I do think that Spielberg was a better filmmaker when he made Jurassic Park than he was Jaws. Like you said, if he had made Jaws later on, if he had made it in the 80s or the 90s or whenever he would have made it, it would be better. It would be a better movie. But I think Jaws it deserves its place in not only Spielberg's films, because obviously it's very popular. It is one of the most popular movies of all time, and people still love it. And like you said, there are people that will easily say not only is it their favorite Spielberg movie, it's one of their favorite movies, if not their favorite movie. And I don't have any problem with that. I don't agree personally, but this is a great movie. And I uh, I adore Jaws, but I do think that Spielberg could and did better, not just in that genre, but he made some better films. But that's still kind of nitpicking. This is a great film, and you know that last section, I will take the if I see on TV that Jaws is on and they're on, it's in the last half of the film, forget it. That's what I'm watching, because I'll put that against almost anything.
And yeah, Solid A, not that we have to elaborate on it too much, but a Solid A is far from bad. It's still really excellent. I will never complain about watching Jaws at any point, but it definitely has sections that are some of the best Spielberg material ever. So, yeah. Jaws is still a really terrific movie by every which means. And to elaborate on Ellen Brody again, no, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do that. Keep picking on her. Roy Scheider is so underrated,
Yeah.
and he's in so many great movies, and he's excellent in Jaws. And obviously, that's one huge iconic movie. So some people might say, how could he be underrated? He has Jaws, but I do think that he sometimes gets overshadowed in conversation by other actors that he was around at times. But he's excellent in so many other movies as well. What a great actor, and he's a big part of why Jaws is as good as it is. But like I said before, I think the combination of that trio is at the heart and soul of the movie, and at the height of its success. And I love Richard Dreyfuss, who
Right.
obviously got along with Spielberg just fine. And I think Spielberg's very next movie was a better movie and one of his best movies.
Yeah.
Close Encounters he got to make after
Yeah.
this, which Jaws was so successful. Spielberg had the keys to the kingdom. Basically, Spielberg could do whatever he wanted, and
Right.
he chose to make a movie like Close Encounters, which is almost wild to me in a way. Just to imagine, not to make this whole conversation about Close Encounters, but just the idea that you can make a movie like that. It's hard to imagine today a big budget sci-fi movie like that shot on 70 millimeter film.
Right.
It's just kind of wild. Whereas Jaws is a movie you could imagine in today's marketplace in a certain spirit, at least. And basically the shooting of the shark is the same as the shooting of the Death Star
Right.
a couple of years later. Is the same sort of thing and the same kind of excitement too, complete with John Williams scores.
Yes.
But that building and anticipation and the perfect timing and explosion, like it's all there. Uh, Same kind of thing, adventure action sort of stuff. Yes, Jaws is definitely still a horror movie, but it has those other flavors, same as Jurassic Park, in terms of adventure, horror, action kind of stuff, which is part of the success of the movie. Like I said, Texas Chainsaw is maybe the most pure horror movie. Like here is terror and the feeling of terror in a very real, raw way. Um, and Exorcist is unquestionably horror, but it also is a dramatic movie
Right.
and impactful in that way as well. Jaws has these other larger, lighter kind of things going on as well, and that by no means is a point to denigrate it in the slightest. It's just defining the way these movies work. But they're all three definitely excellent movies, and if I were going to rank the three of them, obviously Jaws we've already established is the least of these, which is still praising it quite highly, even though it's a mite bit controversial because of how high Jaws is on so many people's list. But nonetheless, it's still excellent, and we still love it. But I honestly don't know for sure where I'd put Texas Chainsaw and Exorcist. You talk to me on a different day, and I don't know which one I would put above the other
Right.
because they're different. What they do is so different. Right now, I'm almost leaning towards Exorcist, but it's a coin toss. Do you have any say on that? On where you would rank the two?
I think I think I would firmly put Exorcist ahead, but not like I mean firmly, not saying it's leaps and bounds ahead of it, but I think my preference is for the kind of movie that The Exorcist is,
Yeah,
and but like Texas Chainsaw is not very far behind it. It's right up there. I think Texas Chainsaw is the best movie of its kind. I think it's a one of a kind movie, and people have tried to imitate it so many times, and tried to emulate its success. And it's kind of a really a flash in the pan. But Exorcist is just kind of, I don't know, just this. I mean, it's just a beautifully told, dramatic film that happens to be a horror film. And it's just done in this, it's like, to me, of these three films, and that, to argue which one is more 70s than the other is really is a really stupid argument, and that's not what I'm trying to say. But I when I think Exorcist, I think other 70s dramas too, that I would put The Exorcist in the same ballpark with, like Chinatown, or, you know, The Conversation, or something like these kind of low key but absolutely great drama films that were kind of the cream of the crop. And The Exorcist has that kind of vibe to it, but it also has the horror in it stacked on it. And like, just that combination, to me, just just really solidifies it.
If I was thinking about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I don't know exactly how it's the best of its type, like I've previously suggested, I think imitators want to add stuff to it, or they do too much to make the characters obnoxious or stereotypical,
Right.
or it's accentuating the action or accentuating the gore
Yeah.
or pushing for a certain mythology. There's just so many different ways that that formula can get messed up, and Texas Chainsaw just goes right down the line
Right.
and does all of it perfectly. And I, like I said, I would probably lean towards putting Exorcist above it. My only problem with that is uh, I love both movies, and they're trying to do things in such a different way that it's like I'd like both kinds of things in their own right. But yeah, Exorcist is so rich and powerful, like it moves me in a very specific way. That yeah, it's almost hard to argue against
Right.
that feeling.
Yeah.
But no matter which way you shake it, two excellent movies, three excellent movies, broadly speaking, that we have had in this episode. Classics for a
Yes,
reason,
definitely.
that's for sure. Jaws to me is classic, and I love it, and I'll always watch it. But it's classic in almost a different sense. It's like, oh, look where Spielberg started, and how he got started, and there's definitely moments that showcase how special he was even then, and before that too. But you're kind of seeing the birth of Spielberg too in a lot of ways into the filmmaker he would continue to become, which is great to see in its own way. But I've had fun talking about these three movies with you, Drew.
As have I.
Thanks for talking along with me and watching along with me.
No problem. Pleasure as always.
Thanks, everybody. Of course. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. See you next time here on Movie Marathon Mood.